about 3 women who were crucial in doing the work of the Flying Doctor Service and building the service. These are women who implemented some life-changing programs like School of the Air, remote polio vaccinations, and along the way, these women were all told that they couldn't do what they were doing because they were women. Thankfully, they ignored that advice. The Chief Executive of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, Martin Laverty, is here to tell you about them. Martin, lovely to have you back on the show. Thanks for your time.
Oh, g'day, Chris, and thanks so much for having me back, because last time we spoke about the 3 blokes that started the Flying Doctors, I thought it was just as important to address the contribution that 3 terrific women made to the Flying Doctors as well.
Well, I didn't know until literally now that it was a woman who conceived the idea of the School of the Air, Adelaide Hudson.
That's right. I don't think many Australians know that. So let's step through her life. Adelaide was born in Manoora in South Australia in 1881. She went on, like some women of the time, to have her training as a school teacher. Now, by 1936, she was the president of the National Council of Women. Now, the National Council of Women of Australia still exists today. Its role is to raise awareness of women and girls, to promote their rights and their opportunities as citizens. So Adelaide held a very important role back in 1936. In 1941, she became the first female president or board chair of the Flying Doctors across Central Australia. That's the Northern Territory and South Australia. She also went on to edit the magazine called Air Doctor. Now, to some extent, their achievements in themselves.
Yeah.
President of the National Council of Women, first female chair of the Flying Doctors. Terrific. But her story hadn't really started. On a trip to Alice Springs in 1944, she spoke to a group about recognising shyness in the children of outback Australia because they didn't get the opportunity for social interaction. Now, your listeners will recall last time you and I spoke, we addressed John Flynn asking Alf Traeger to invent a radio system, and that's how the pedal radio network around stations and properties in remote Australia came to be, so that people could talk to their doctors. Well, Adelaide reckoned there was an opportunity to, quote, bridge the lonely distance for the kids of country Australia. And she suggested to Flynn that we could use the pedal radio network to be able to give educational talks to children. So with that idea, she took it and she ran with it. And on the 8th of June in 1951, the first official lessons were sent from the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Alice Springs to children in remote homesteads across parts of the Northern Territory and into Queensland. And of course, the School of the Air still operates today. Some of your listeners might have visited in either Broken Hill or in Alice Springs, and there's still kids today whose main access to education is the School of the Air. But this is the legacy that Adelaide Hudson left by being one of those visionaries who saw what was effectively a medical infrastructure and suggesting it had another use by using it to deliver schooling and education to kids right across Australia. She died in 1962 and she was awarded an OBE during her lifetime for her service to women, to education and the children of country Australia.
Martin, can I ask you why the Royal Flying Doctor Service was giving women like Adelaide those sorts of opportunities in the early 40s and even the 30s when nobody else was?
Well, remember how Flynn was able to gather up the resources for the Flying Doctors to come together in the first place. He was written to by Cliff Peel suggesting the use of aircraft. Hudson Fysh proposed the financing for the purchase of the first aircraft, and I suspect Adelaide Hudson was no different. She came up with a good idea, she pitched it to John Flynn, and Flynn was one of those very receptive leaders that knew a good idea when he saw it, and it didn't matter at all where it came from. But I think it's important to recognise that we still have a debate in this country today about the importance of women in the boardroom. Well, the Flying Doctors back in 1941 was ahead of the game and had a chair as a female. And in fact, I'm very proud to say that my chair today, Beth Vanstone, fills that same role some 60 years on.
And what a chair she'd be, I would imagine.
That's great fun.
And then there's Beth Garrett, and she was the first female Royal Flying Doctor Service pilot. She funded her flying licence from her salary as a secretary. I mean, I would imagine she wasn't being paid in sheep stations. It wouldn't have been substantive, so it would have taken her a while to save it up.
Well picked. Beth was also one of those women who was told that she couldn't fulfil her dreams. She was born in Melbourne in 1926, and she joined the Royal Victorian Aero Club when she turned 21 in 1947. She'd actually had to wait 5 years to do so because her mother said to her, "No daughter of mine is going flying." But pleasingly, she persevered, and in 1947, at the end of her first year in training, she maintained or graduated from her pilot training, but she'd been working as a secretary during that period to fund the significant expense of her flying time. And there's a tale told that part of the way she scrimped and saved was by wearing the same navy blue uniform that she'd purchased on sale at half price for 3 years. So she got a lot of value out of those threads to be able to save up to fund her pilot training. Now, Beth was the first woman in Australia to receive her airline transport licence. That's a significant achievement. But then she did even more. In 1952, she was the first woman to obtain a commercial and instructor's licence. So she was the first pilot teacher, the first woman pilot teacher in Australia. And very pleasingly, she joined the Flying Doctors in 1958. She became our first female pilot. She was then flying a Beechcraft Queen Air and was working across parts of northern Queensland. Now, very sadly, she lost her husband, who was also a pilot, in an air accident. He died in Townsville in 1953, but she'd go on to fly herself for another 35, 40 years. She became the chief pilot for the Flying Doctors when she was based in Cairns, and she flew with us until the mid-1980s. Now, Chris, I've got a favour to ask, because as I was going back through Beth's notes and history, and we've got a great repository about Beth's life, but we don't actually know if she's still with us. And I suspect there might be someone listening, there might be someone within your audience who either knows if Beth is still with us, maybe a family member, and if they wanted to go to flyingdoctor.org.au, they'd be able to get in contact and let us know, because we'd love to maintain that connection. And to some extent, we shouldn't have lost track. But if someone's listening and if someone knows, is Beth still with us? And indeed, are her family members still carrying on this really important story of Beth Garrett, the first female pilot for the Flying Doctors?
Again, that's at a time, when women pilots, she was the first, but then in later years, their gender worked against them for many, many decades. That was quite a revolutionary thing for the Royal Flying Doctor Service to appoint a woman as its chief pilot.
Well, once again, in both Australia and internationally around the world, there's currently a shortage of pilots, but within that shortage, there is an overwhelming lack of female pilots. So I regularly talk to school leavers or those who are starting out on their careers, and I certainly encourage those who are thinking about working in the health profession to work in country Australia. But I also encourage young people, and young women in particular, to consider a career as a pilot or as an engineer in aviation. It's a great opportunity, not only to see country Australia, but to see the world. And there is fantastic pathways at the moment to support young women into their flying careers. But once again, I think the Flying Doctors has always been very practical. We will welcome anyone who wants to contribute to better lives for country Australians, and perhaps that's why when Adelaide came up with her idea of School of the Air, and when Beth approached the Flying Doctors to become our first female pilot, that the organisation was willing and embraced both of them, because realistically, gender shouldn't have mattered even back then.
There's a lot of people will be saying, oh, for a gender-blind employer. Robin Miller also has a great story. She was known as the Sugar Lady. Why?
Robin Miller's, I think, lived an absolutely terrific life, and she was born in Perth, in Western Australia, Subiaco, in fact, and she comes from a particularly famous Australian family. If you'll allow me to get just a bit distracted for a moment, her mother was Dame Mary Durack, and some of your listeners might know Dame Durack as the author of Kings of the Grass Castle. Now, I was given this book maybe 30 years ago, and I recall it quite vividly. It's about the story of an Irish immigrant who led the Overlanders, a group of cattlemen who took cattle into the north and the tropics of Queensland on foot about a century ago. So So her mother was a very famous and significant author. Her father, well, he was pretty well known as well. Horry Miller co-founded one of Australia's earliest airlines, McRobertson Miller Airlines. And there's actually a little link because flying, if you like, was part of Robin Miller's family business. She first trained as a nurse, again, a bit like Adelaide, who became a teacher. Robin took perhaps the predictable pathway for many women at that particular stage, training as a nurse. But while she was training as a nurse, she also trained as a pilot, and she received her private pilot licence and her commercial flying licence. But she did so in the 1960s at a time where there wasn't the job opportunities, and she approached the commercial airlines, she approached the charter airlines, and she was told she couldn't fly with them for the single reason that she was a woman. Being unable to get paid work, at this stage in the 1960s in Western Australia, there was a significant outbreak of polio, and polio was impacting Aboriginal communities in the north of the state in particular. So she pitched a terrific idea first to the West Australian Health Department. She said, I've got a pilot's licence. If I can get a plane, because I'm a nurse, will you support me to vaccinate in Aboriginal communities against polio? Now, very pleasingly, the West Australian Health Department said yes, and they introduced her to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And over the course of the next 12 months or so, she raised money to purchase a Cessna 182 Skyline. Now, that aircraft by today's standards might cost about $500,000 or so. So she had to undertake some pretty hefty fundraising, and I know that she drew on her family connections to do so. But once she had her little Cessna, she would then set off flying among West Australian Aboriginal communities, and over the course of her career she actually flew 43,000 air miles, and during her working life she would vaccinate 37,000 Western Australians, principally Aboriginal children, against polio. Now, the reason she became known as the Sugarbird Lady is at that stage the polio vaccination was an oral vaccination, and trust me, Chris, it tasted awful. So her trick was to serve it with a sugar cube. So in Aboriginal communities, the kids very quickly labelled her the Sugarbird Lady, and that name, that arrival with the sweet hit of sugar, meant that the kids were not scared about this nurse flying in herself unaccompanied on her own plane that she'd funded by the money that she'd raised to be able to save the lives of 37,000 people who otherwise were exposed to the risk of polio. Now, she married into the Flying Doctors family. She married the then director of the Flying Doctors in West Australia, Harold Dix. Very sadly, she got cancer in the early 1970s, passed away in Perth in 1975. But if anyone is ever in West Australia and you visit the Flying Doctors at our base at Jandakot, the plane that she flew in has been restored, and it's outside the front door of the Flying Doctors in West Australia, and we honour her memory as we do all of the women of our past. Without these contributions of women in the early days, the contribution of women today wouldn't be as easy and taken for granted as it should be.
They're wonderful stories that I'm sure people were unaware of, and it's great to hear that the Royal Flying Doctor Service was ahead of the curve when it came to being gender blind in employment. Martin Laverty, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for telling us the remarkable stories of Adelaide Mithkey, Beth Garrett and Robin Miller.
No worries, Chris, and once again, thanks so much for your interest.
Thanks, Martin. Now, if you can help Martin out with Beth Garrett, by the way, that website you might want to go to is flying